They say the West will take everything from you if you let it. Your land, your pride, your family, and sometimes even your will to keep breathing. Folks out here don't expect kindness. Most days, you're lucky if you get a nod and a word before the dust swallows the man you passed on the trail. Elias Ward lived in that kind of quiet. His ranch sat on the far edge of nowhere, a crooked line of fence posts and weather-beaten boards holding back the wild. He wasn't a man folks visited unless they had to. He kept to himself, worked from sunup to sundown, and spoke in short, steady words that didn't invite questions. Some said he liked it that way. Others whispered that he was hiding from the world. The land around him was dry, the kind that drank up rain faster than the clouds could give it. In the evenings, the wind carried a low hum, sliding over the hills and rattling the barn doors. Nights could feel endless, the kind where the dark pressed against your skin and the silence seemed to listen. Elias had known plenty of trouble in his time, but trouble had a way of giving a man warning before it came. This time it didn't. It arrived on a night without a moon, when the stars hung cold and the air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic like old blood. He didn't know it yet, but before the sun rose again, his life would no longer be just about mending fences and counting cattle. Something, or rather, someone, was about to step into his world. And once they did, neither of them would ever be the same. The sound came soft at first, so soft Elias thought it might be the wind dragging loose wire across the fence. But the wind had died an hour ago, leaving only that faint, uneven thump. It came again, sharper this time, like something or someone shifting where they didn't belong. He pulled on his coat and grabbed the lantern, the glass rattling faintly as he lit it. The barn sat about 50 yards from the house, its shadow stretching long and black under the stars. The old boards groaned when the cold set in, but tonight the creaks were different, hesitant, like they came from a living thing. When he reached the door, he paused, listening. Nothing, just the slow, steady breath of the night. Still, he unlatched it, letting the lantern's glow spill into the dark. The air inside was sharp with the smell of hay, leather, and something else, sweat, fear, and the faint tang of blood. Dust drifted through the light like lazy snow. Elias stepped in, the wood floor flexing under his boots. The horses shifted in their stalls, ears twitching toward him, but their eyes weren't on him. They were watching the far corner. He followed their gaze. At first, all he saw was a tangle of old burlap sacks and a dark shape against the wall. Then the shape moved, and his stomach tightened. It was a woman, or what was left of her strength. Her dress was torn and caked with dirt. Rope cut into her wrists, her hands bound tight behind her back. One side of her face was swollen, a deep bruise spreading under her eye. Her head jerked up at the sound of his boots. Wide, glassy eyes fixed on him, the white stark against the grime. She pressed herself back against the wall, her breath quickening like a cornered animal's. Elias stopped where he was, keeping the lantern low. "You hurt bad?" he asked, his voice low even. She didn't answer. Her eyes darted between him and the door, as if measuring the distance. "I ain't here to harm you," he said after a moment. "But you need to tell me if you're hurt." She swallowed, but still said nothing. He could see the way her shoulders trembled, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Whoever had left her here hadn't meant for her to be found. Not alive, anyway. The wind picked up outside, rattling the barn walls. Elias glanced toward the dark hills beyond, a feeling settling heavy in his gut. Trouble had come to his land, and had a face now. Elias set the lantern down on an overturned crate and pulled a knife from his belt. He moved slow, keeping his steps measured so she could see everyone. "I'm going to cut you loose," he said, his voice steady but soft. "No sudden moves. Just breathe." Her eyes stayed locked on the blade, tension running through her like a wire about to snap. When he crouched beside her, she flinched hard, pressing her back against the wall as far as it would go. The rope around her wrists was rough, frayed from strain. He slid the knife under it and saw the skin beneath, raw, angry red with flecks of dried blood. The last strand gave way with a quiet snap, and she pulled her hands to her chest, curling her fingers in as if she didn't quite believe they were free. Elias stood, took a step back and nodded toward the water bucket in the corner. You can drink if you're able. She hesitated, then crawled toward it, scooping water into her palms and drinking fast, coughing when it caught her throat. What's your name? He asked. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Doesn't matter. It matters to me, he replied. Her gaze flickered toward him, sharp for a moment before softening again. Clara. All right, Clara, Elias said. You can stay in the house tonight. Safer than out here. She straightened a little, suspicion in her eyes. Why? Because whoever left you here might come looking to finish it. The words hung heavy in the air. She looked down at the floorboards, jaw tightening. They will, she whispered. Elias didn't push her for more. He just picked up the lantern and gestured toward the door. Come on, you'll freeze in here. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady, and followed him out into the cold. The night air bit at their skin, and in the distance, a coyote's howl stretched long across the hills. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder, and Elias noticed she never looked toward the stars, only into the dark, as if something in it was watching her back. Inside the ranch house, the air smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. Elias set the lantern on the table, its warm light spilling across the worn floorboards and the rough-hewn walls. Clara stood just inside the door, her shoulders hunched, her eyes scanning every corner like she needed to make sure there wasn't another threat hiding in the shadows. He gestured toward the chair closest to the fire. Sit. You'll warm faster. She stayed standing a moment longer, as if weighing the offer, then lowered herself into the chair. The firelight caught the bruises along her cheek, the dried blood on her lip. Elias poured her a mug of water from the kettle and slid it across the table. They sat in silence for a while. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Clara kept her hands wrapped around the mug, as though the warmth might keep her from shaking. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and hoarse. You ever trust someone so much you stop looking over your shoulder? Elias glanced up from the fire. Once or twice. That's how they get you, she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. You think you're safe. You think you know him. And then one day you wake up tied to a post with your mouth bleeding and your pockets turned out. He didn't interrupt. She seemed to need the space to let the words fall. They were supposed to be my friends, she went on, the bitterness in her voice sharpening. We were traveling together. 4 of us, headed toward the rail line in Carson. I didn't have much, just a little money, some clothes, and a silver locket my mother gave me before she died. I thought we'd look out for each other. Instead, she shook her head. Instead, they decided I was worth more dead than alive. Elias' jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. They took everything I had, beat me when I tried to fight. Then they left me in your barn like I was nothing but trash for the flies. Her hands clenched around the mug, knuckles white. They'll come back, not because they care whether I'm alive, but because I still know their faces. I know what they did. Elias leaned back in his chair, the firelight catching the lines in his face. If they come back, they won't like what they find. For the first time since he'd found her, Clara met his eyes fully. There was no trust yet. Not exactly, but there was something new. Maybe the start of believing that someone, somewhere, might still stand between her and the dark. The next morning broke slow and gray, the sun hidden behind a sheet of pale clouds. Elias was out in the yard splitting wood when he spotted movement far out along the ridge. At first it was just a shimmer in the cold light, but then it took shape. 3 riders, moving steady but slow, as if they weren't in a hurry because they already knew where they were headed. He stood still, the axe hanging loose in his hands. The riders stayed on the horizon for a while, then disappeared into a dip in the land. That meant they'd be here in less than an hour. Inside, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her fingers wrapped so tight around the mug Elias thought it might crack. She looked up when he came in, reading his face before he spoke. They found me, she said quietly. Elias didn't answer right away. He set the axe by the door, then reached for the rifle that leaned against the wall. They're still a ways out. Gives us some time. Clara pushed back from the table, her chair legs scraping against the floor. We should run. There's still a chance. He shook his head. If we run, they'll chase. And out there, it's open land. We won't get far before they catch up. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the window. Then what? We make it so they can't take what they came for. The words hung in the room like smoke. Clara didn't argue, but she moved toward the fire and crouched beside it, rubbing her arms. Elias began checking the rifle, sliding bullets into place with practiced motions. Then he crossed the door and dropped the heavy bar across it. Windows stay shut. Don't move from the main room unless I say. Clara's gaze followed him, her face pale. You don't even know if you can win against them. I've lived out here a long time, Elias said, his voice low. Long enough to know some things are worth standing for. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hooves drawing nearer. By the time the riders appeared at the edge of the yard, the sun had burned through the clouds, spilling pale light across the dry earth. They slowed their horses to a walk, their eyes fixed on the ranch house. The one in front, a tall man in a long, dust-stained coat, sat straight in the saddle, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth like he'd already decided how this day would end. Elias stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, but not raised. He didn't say a word, just watched them close the gap. Clara stayed inside, standing back from the window, her breath coming fast. When the horses stopped a dozen yards from the porch, the tall man spoke first. Mornin', friend. We're here for a woman that don't belong to you. Elias didn't move. Ain't got anyone here who belongs to me. The man's grin widened, though his eyes stayed cold. She's ours, one way or another. Hand her over, and maybe you get to keep breathing easy. Elias tilted his head, looking past the speaker at the other two riders. Rough men with hard eyes, the kind who'd done plenty of bad and never lost sleep over it. Last I checked, he said slowly, people ain't property, and she ain't going anywhere with the likes of you. The tall man's face shifted, the grin slipping just enough to show the steel underneath. Then I reckon we'll have to take her. The moment hung for a breath, still as glass. Then Elias raised the rifle. The first shot cracked through the morning air, sending one of the riders diving from his saddle. The other two kicked their horses forward, dirt flying from hooves as they reached for their guns. The yard erupted in noise, gunfire, shouts, the sharp whine of bullets striking wood. Elias moved with the kind of precision that only comes from years of practice, firing, shifting, and reloading without panic. A bullet splintered the porch rail near his leg, but he didn't flinch. One rider fell hard to the ground, his weapon skittering away. The tall man stayed in the saddle, firing toward the porch, but Elias' next shot caught his coat, jerking him sideways. He clung to the reins, swearing, before yanking his horse back. The remaining men exchanged a look, and, just like that, the fight bled out of them. The tall man spat in the dirt, his voice low and mean. This ain't over. Elias didn't answer. He just kept the rifle leveled until they turned their horses and rode off, their figures shrinking against the horizon. Only then did he lower the gun, the weight of the silence pressing in. Inside, Clara still hadn't moved from the window, her eyes wide, not with fear now, but with something else. The yard was quiet again, except for the slow creak of the porch boards under Elias' boots as he stepped back inside. Clara was still by the window, her hands pressed together so tightly her knuckles were white. When their eyes met, she didn't speak. She just let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding since the first shot was fired. They're gone, Elias said simply, leaning the rifle against the wall. She nodded, but her gaze drifted to the door as if she half expected them to come charging back. They'll try again, she murmured. Maybe, he said, pouring 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove. But they won't find you here alone. She took the cup, the warmth soaking into her fingers. You didn't have to do that for me, she said softly. Elias looked at her, his voice steady. No one deserves to be left to die in a barn. For the first time, she smiled, small, tentative but real. The firelight caught in her eyes, softening the edges of her fear. She sipped the coffee, and they sat in the quiet, the kind that felt less like loneliness and more like a shared peace. Days turned into weeks. Clara began helping around the ranch, mending fences, tending the horses, even laughing once in a while. She still carried her scars, but they didn't seem to weigh her down quite as much. Elias never asked her to stay, and she never said she would. But every morning, when the sun rose over the hills and caught the barn in gold, she was still there. And in a land that remembered cruelty all too well, that small choice felt like the beginning of something worth holding on to. Some stories fade into the dust, but others, they stay with you. If this one stayed with you, share it so it rides a little farther. And if you want to hear more tales from the forgotten edges of the West, saddle up and subscribe. There's always another story on the horizon.